One forbidden transmission unleashed humanity's most terrifying fury. The signal hit my console at 3:14 in the morning station time. I was already awake. I am always awake at that hour because the relay buffers on the Ardent Vigil spike with ghost noise every night around 3, and if you do not catch it fast, you spend the next 6 hours untangling corrupted data strings. It is not a glamorous job. Signals analysis on a deep space diplomatic relay station never is. Most of my colleagues back on Earth thought I had taken a punishment posting. Maybe they were right. My name is Cale Mercer. I am 31 years old. I have been stationed on the Ardent Vigil for 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days. I know the exact number because I count them, not out of misery, out of habit. When you work with signals, you count everything. The Ardent Vigil sits at the edge of compact space, which means it sits at the edge of everything that matters politically in this part of the galaxy. The Galactic Compact is an alliance of over 200 species, most of them older than human civilization by several thousand years. Humanity joined the Compact 83 years ago, after first contact with the Silhari. We were welcomed the way you welcome a neighbor's large dog into your home, cautiously, with the door left open behind you, just in case. The Compact does not hate humans. They are simply careful around us. There are old records in the Compact archives, records that predate our membership, in which the senior species described humanity using a specific phrase. The phrase translates roughly as the species that does not calculate the cost before it acts. They meant it as a warning to each other. Over the decades of peace, most of them forgot why they wrote it. That night, I was the only one in the communications room. Petty Officer Dana Cole was supposed to be on shift with me, but she had come down with something from the mess hall and was in medical. Lieutenant Harry Good was asleep in his bunk after a double shift. Commander Alan Voss, the senior human officer on the station, was in a 12-hour diplomatic briefing with Velhari Syndicate representatives about mining rights in the outer sectors. The briefing had been going on for 9 days. It would, I later learned, go on for exactly 9 more minutes after I hit transmit. The signal that came in was not in any buffer I recognized. It was not on a standard frequency. It was not on any emergency band I had been trained on. It was bleeding through on the Omega-7 channel, which I had been told about exactly once, in a single paragraph of a training document, in language so bureaucratic it barely registered. The Omega-7 band is prohibited under compact law. It penetrates all known jamming technology, all encryption fields, all signal suppression systems. It was closed by compact treaty after a species called the Drethani used it to coordinate a military campaign 3 centuries ago. The treaty is considered one of the most ironclad pieces of compact law in existence. Using it carries a minimum sentence of 30 years exile from compact space. I sat there for a moment, looking at the signal indicator, and I thought, someone is using it anyway, and then I put on my headset. The first thing I heard was static, deep, layered static, the kind that comes from signal degradation over a long distance. Then, underneath it, a voice. A child's voice. She was speaking clearly, in standard English, which told me the signal was human in origin. She was reciting what sounded like coordinates, followed by a repeating identification code, followed by a message. She was calm in the way that children are calm when they have been frightened for so long that calm becomes the only thing left. She said, "This is Vethara Colony. We are still here. We need help. The adults are very sick. There are 112 children in the shelter. We have food for maybe 20 more days. If anyone can hear this, please come. We have been sending this signal for 4 months. Please come." Then it repeated. I pulled up the coordinates. Vethara's deep, a colony world in the mid-sectors. I cross-referenced it against compact records. The compact database listed it as uninhabited. Resettlement completed 8 months ago. All 4,200 colonists relocated to the Doreth system. I sat very still for about 30 seconds. Then I pulled a different database. Human settlement records maintained independently by Earth's colonial administration, not by the Compact. Vethara's Deep appeared there too with a very different entry. The colony was founded 11 years ago. Primary industry, agricultural development and soil research. Population at last census, 4,214. Resettlement status, pending as of 6 months ago. No completion record on file. The Compact had marked it as done. Earth's records showed it was never finished. I started cross-referencing signal logs. If this girl had been broadcasting for 4 months on a prohibited frequency, the signal should have been detected and suppressed by Compact monitoring systems within hours of the first transmission. It should never have reached me. What had actually happened, I figured out in the next 12 minutes, was a cascading relay malfunction 2 sectors over. A series of Compact monitoring buoys had gone offline for maintenance, creating a temporary gap in the suppression network. The Omega-7 signal had slipped through the gap like water through a crack in a wall. It had reached my console by complete accident. If the buoys had been serviced on schedule, I never would have heard it. I sat there in the quiet of the communications room, with that child's voice looping in my headset, and I thought about what I was supposed to do. Proper procedure was clear. Log the signal. Report it to Commander Voss. Submit a formal inquiry through the Compact's Communication Oversight Bureau, which would assign a case number, review it through the relevant subcommittee, and issue a preliminary finding within 4 to 6 standard months. I thought about a 9-year-old girl sitting in a shelter on a planet that the galaxy had decided did not exist anymore, reciting coordinates into a transmitter because all the adults were too sick to do it. I thought about 20 more days of food. I pulled up the broadcast array. The Ardent Vigil sits at a relay junction that connects to every major human communication network in this sector: military installations, colony ships, civilian vessels, Earth's colonial fleet, all of it. The Omega-7 band, once rebroadcast on standard channels, would reach every one of them. My hand was on the transmit control for a long time. I want to be honest about that. I was afraid. Not of the consequences to myself, though those were real and large. I was afraid because I knew, in some part of my brain that understood systems and signals and what happens when you change the parameters of a situation, that once I sent this, the situation would change in ways I could not predict and could not stop. The girl's voice came around again on the loop. "Please come. We have been sending this signal for 4 months. Please come." I hit transmit. The moment I hit that button, I stopped being a signals analyst. I became the reason the galaxy learned to be afraid of us again. The first response came in 6 minutes. Not from the fleet, not from any official source, from a cargo hauler called the Evening Star, registration out of Proxima Colony, currently running supply routes 3 sectors away. The captain, a man named Oliver Fenn, came over the open channel and said, "Ardent Vigil, we copied that relay. We are changing course. What is the situation on the ground?" I told him everything I knew. He acknowledged and cut the channel. That was all. 4 minutes after that, the colony transport vessel Meridian Dawn, carrying agricultural equipment to the Doreth system, diverted. Then a private survey ship. Then a Compact licensed human merchant vessel whose captain did not even ask questions. She just changed course and told me to keep the channel open. Within 40 minutes of my transmission, 11 human vessels had changed course toward Vethara's Deep. I was still at my console, watching this happen, when the communications room door opened and Commander Alan Voss walked in. He was still wearing his diplomatic briefing jacket. His face was very calm, which, with Commander Voss, usually meant the opposite of calm. He said, "Mercer, explain to me what you did." I explained. I showed him the signal. I showed him the colonial records discrepancy. I played him the girl's voice. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You broadcast on an Omega-7 relay." "Yes, sir." "To every human channel in the sector." "Yes, sir." He looked at the vessel count on my screen. It was at 19 now. "How long ago?" 53 minutes, sir." He pulled up a chair and sat down next to me. He did not call security. He did not initiate my arrest or log a formal incident report or contact the Compact Oversight Bureau. He just sat down, looked at the screen, and said, "Let us see what happens." What happened was difficult to describe to someone who has never watched a species wake up. Within 2 hours, the vessel count was 64. Within 4 hours, it was over 100. But the numbers by themselves do not capture what was actually happening, because this was not a coordinated response. There was no fleet order, no emergency declaration from Earth's government, no admiral issuing directives. The vessels that were coming had heard the signal and made their own decisions, independently in the same direction, for the same reason. A colony transport altered course and radioed its company headquarters to report the change. The company headquarters did not order it back. Instead, they diverted 3 other ships they had in the region. A military supply runner, technically outside its patrol zone, filed a course correction with the Compact's traffic authority under the category Emergency Humanitarian Response, and continued on without waiting for the approval that would not have come. A civilian research vessel sent a message to the Human Colonial Authority on Earth. The message said, "Vethara's deep colony is alive and in distress. We are responding. Please advise Fleet Command." The Colonial Authority forwarded it to Fleet Command. Fleet Command did not issue orders. What Fleet Command did was quietly unlock the movement restrictions on 12 rapid response vessels that had been docked at the Ellison station for routine maintenance. No one said go, everyone went. I sat at my console and watched it unfold, and I felt something I do not have a good word for. It was not pride exactly. It was more like recognition, like watching something confirm what it already was. The Compact's response was slower. It took them nearly 3 hours to realize what was happening, which told me their monitoring of human channels was not as sharp as they liked to pretend. When they did realize it, their first action was to contact Commander Voss directly. The call came through on the diplomatic channel. It was Senior Arbiter Darath of the Velhari Syndicate, one of the representatives who had been in the briefing with Voss for 9 days. He was a tall, angular being with pale gray skin and the careful manner of someone who had spent centuries in political chambers. He looked at Commander Voss through the screen and said, "Commander, you will instruct your vessels to return to their registered courses. This matter falls under Compact jurisdiction." Commander Voss said, "Which matter?" Darath said, "The Vethara situation." Commander Voss said, "The Vethara situation in which 4,000 colonists were listed as resettled when they were not." Darath said, "That is an administrative matter currently under review." Commander Voss said, "How long has it been under review?" Darath did not answer that. Commander Voss said, "The vessels are not under my command, Arbiter. They responded to a distress signal. So did I, frankly." Darath's expression shifted in a way I had not seen on a Compact official before. It was subtle, just a tightening around the eyes. I had spent 2 years watching the Silhari, the Velhari, the Dreth, the Compact species up close, learning to read their faces the way you learn to read signal patterns. What I saw on Darath's face in that moment was not anger. It was the first edge of fear. He said, "Commander, you understand what the humans are doing will be interpreted as an act of provocation against the Compact." Commander Voss said, very quietly, "You understand what the Compact did will be interpreted as something considerably worse." The channel went silent. Within an hour, the Compact had ordered a blockade fleet to Vethara's deep. 30 warships, drawn from 3 different member species, sent to establish what the Compact called a containment perimeter around the system. The official communication described it as a protective measure to ensure the situation was handled through proper channels. When the news of the blockade reached the incoming human vessels, I watched their response on my tracking board. Not one of them stopped. Not one changed course. The merchant ships, the colony transports, the civilian survey vessels, the unlocked military runners from Ellison Station. They all continued toward Vethara's Deep with the same steady trajectory they had been holding since the moment they heard that child's voice. By the time the compact blockade arrived at Vethara's Deep, there were 214 human vessels already in the system. I did not know Admiral Soren Vale at that point. I would come to know him well in the weeks that followed. Soren Vale was 67 years old, a Compact Wars veteran who had been retired for 8 years, living quietly on a farm on New Darwin. Someone had contacted him in the first hours after my transmission. I never found out who. I only know that within 11 hours of that transmission, Admiral Soren Vale was aboard a vessel headed to Vethara's Deep, and the vessel he was aboard had declared him its acting commander by unanimous crew vote. No orders, no rank restoration, no paperwork. They just voted. Admiral Vale's single communication to the Compact's Supreme Arbiter was transmitted 12 hours after my broadcast. It was 7 words long. "Move your ships or we move them." I read it 3 times. Then I thought about how, for 80 years, the Compact had updated their assessment of humanity, how they had quietly reclassified us from unpredictable and potentially dangerous to manageable and largely cooperative, how they had built an entire political architecture around the assumption that humans had changed. They had not understood that humans had not changed. Humans had simply been given nothing to respond to. I was still thinking about that when Lieutenant Harry Good walked into the communications room in his sleep clothes, looked at my board and said, "Is that vessel count real?" "Yes," I said. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he walked to the coffee station, poured 2 cups, handed one to me and sat down. He did not ask what was going to happen next. I think he already knew. The Compact sent Elder Thesson to negotiate. This was, by any measure, a serious move. Elder Thesson of the Vreth was 140 years old and had personally mediated 39 interspecies conflicts. She had negotiated the end of the Doreth resource disputes, the Velhari border crisis, and the Silhari territorial realignment of 2187. She was considered the finest diplomatic mind in Compact history. When the Compact sent Elder Thesson, they were signaling that they understood the gravity of the situation. What they did not understand was that the gravity of the situation was already past the point where Elder Thesson could affect it. I was brought to Vethara's Deep aboard a Compact courier vessel, under a loose form of custody. The Compact wanted me contained. They wanted me charged, processed, and removed from the situation as quickly as possible. The problem they ran into was that removing me required going through the 3 human crew members of the Ardent Vigil who had quietly positioned themselves between me and the Compact security officers. No order had been given. No plan had been made. Petty Officer Dana Cole had apparently recovered from whatever had struck her down in the mess hall. Lieutenant Good had apparently finished sleeping. They both stood in the corridor outside the communications room, and when the Compact officers came to escort me, Dana Cole looked at them and said, "He is not going anywhere right now." One of the Compact officers explained the legal basis for my detention. Dana Cole listened to all of it and then said, "That is interesting. He is still not going anywhere right now." They stood there for 4 hours. Commander Voss eventually arranged a compromise in which I would accompany the Compact representatives to Vethara's Deep as a witness rather than a detainee. I do not know what that compromise cost him politically. He never told me. The system around Vethara's Deep, when we arrived, looked like nothing I had ever seen. 214 human vessels of every class and configuration, arranged with no visible order, and yet covering every approach vector into the planet with overlapping fields. The compact blockade fleet of 30 ships was still present, holding position at the outer edge of the system, looking, from my observer's seat, considerably smaller than it had probably seemed when it departed. Elder Thesson began formal negotiations with Admiral Vale in the second hour after our arrival. She was extraordinary. I will say that honestly. She opened with a full acknowledgement that the compact had failed in its administrative duties regarding the Vethara colony. She named it plainly and without deflection. She offered reparations, a formal independent inquiry with full compact cooperation, criminal accountability proceedings against the Velhari Syndicate representatives responsible for the suppression order, and the immediate dispatch of compact medical relief vessels to the planet's surface. She estimated the full resolution process, conducted properly through compact legal channels, would take 8 to 12 standard years. Admiral Vale listened to everything she said. He was a short man, stocky, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of stillness that comes not from calm but from complete certainty. When Elder Thesson finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 72 hours. Elder Thesson said, I beg your pardon. Admiral Vale said, the people on that planet have been there for 6 months. You have 72 hours to begin their evacuation and treatment, or we will do it ourselves. Elder Thesson said, Admiral, the compact's legal framework cannot operate on that timeline. There are procedures. Admiral Vale said, 72 hours. He did not say it loudly. He did not say it with any particular emphasis. He said it the way you say a fact, the way you say the name of a planet or the distance between 2 stars. It simply was. Elder Thesson returned to the compact diplomatic vessel. She spent the next several hours attempting to persuade the Compact Council to accept the timeline. I know this because I was watching the Council's internal communication channels, which I had been quietly granted access to by Admiral Vale's intelligence officer, a young woman named Claire Hobbs who had the organized, unhurried manner of someone who had already thought 12 steps ahead of the situation. What I watched in those compact channels was a council that genuinely believed humans were applying pressure tactics. They believed the 72-hour deadline was a negotiating position. They believed it because that is how negotiations work. You state an extreme position, the other side states an extreme position, and the middle ground is where the agreement lives. This is how every species in the compact had operated for centuries. They ran the numbers. They calculated that the political cost of conceding to human demands on this timeline was greater than the political cost of waiting them out. They concluded that humans, ultimately, would not escalate a border incident over 4,000 colonists. They kept running those numbers for 51 hours. What changed their calculation was not the deadline. It was what I did at hour 43. I had been given access to the compact database as part of my witness status. Nobody had told me I could not look at classified administrative records. Nobody had thought to specify it because nobody had imagined I would find what I found. The Vethara colony was not relocated because of resource assessment. It was quarantined. 8 months before my transmission, a Velhari Syndicate mining operation in Vethara's deep had accidentally ruptured a deep soil chemical seam while drilling for compact licensed ore deposits. The rupture released a slow-moving soil toxin that contaminated the water table across 30% of the colony's growing land. The toxin produced symptoms that resembled a common respiratory illness. Within 4 months of exposure, at sufficient concentration, it was fatal. The Velhari Syndicate had commissioned an internal study. The study concluded that public disclosure of the contamination would expose the syndicate to liability claims exceeding the total value of the ore deposit. The study recommended a different course of action. The colonists' communication systems were to be gradually degraded and finally suppressed under the cover of a routine relay maintenance upgrade. The colony was to be listed as successfully resettled in compact records. The situation would, in the study's precise and bloodless language, resolve naturally within 18 to 24 months. The Velhari Syndicate had submitted this plan to 3 compact arbiters for sign-off. All 3 had approved it. I found the approval documents. I found the internal study. I found the communication logs showing the deliberate suppression of the colony's signal systems over a period of 3 months. I found the medical assessment that had been sealed under a compact security classification. I broadcast all of it. Not to the human fleet, to every open channel in the galaxy. The compact channel I had been watching went very quiet for about 2 minutes after I sent the files. Then it erupted in a way that took me several minutes to fully process. Not with anger at the Velhari Syndicate, not initially. With alarm at what the disclosure meant politically. Species who had trusted the compact's administrative integrity were suddenly looking at documentation that showed 3 sitting arbiters had signed off on leaving 4,000 human colonists to quietly disappear. Elder Thesson came back to the negotiating channel 6 hours later. She looked, for the first time, like someone who was not entirely in control of her situation. She said, "Admiral Vale, I must inform you that what your signals officer has done has created an extremely serious." Admiral Vale said, "How many hours left?" Elder Thesson said, 17. Admiral Vale said, "Then we have 17 hours to talk." I was watching the compact's external sensor feeds during those 17 hours. What I saw was human engineering crews, deployed from 4 of the larger vessels, constructing something in open space near the outer edge of the planet's orbital path. It was a modular framework, the kind used for rapid planetary surface access operations. They were not threatening to build it. They were not using it as a bargaining chip or a demonstration. They were simply building it, methodically and without drama, because the timeline said it might be needed, and the crew had decided that if it was going to be needed, they wanted it ready. Elder Thesson's delegation watched the construction on their sensor feeds for 11 hours. I watched them watching it. I saw the exact moment their calculation changed. It was not when the framework was complete. It was when a compact defense analyst on the diplomatic vessel ran a construction rate projection and reported to Elder Thesson that the framework would be operational 4 hours before the deadline expired. They had planned for the deadline. They had been building since before the negotiations resumed. The deadline expired at 900 station time. Elder Thesson had no new offer on the table. The compact blockade fleet was still in position. Admiral Vale came onto the command channel. His voice was completely even. "All vessels begin approach." I had read a lot of history. I had studied the 12 conflicts humans had been involved in since first contact. I had read the compact's own archived threat assessments of human military capability, documents that most humans never saw because the compact had never shared them with us. I knew what was coming. I do not think the compact did. The engagement at Vethara's Deep lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. I watched most of it from the observation deck of Admiral Vale's command vessel, the Alcyone, positioned at the outer edge of the engagement zone. Claire Hobbs stood beside me for the first hour, quietly narrating what she saw on her tactical display for my benefit, before the pace of events made narration impossible. I want to describe what I actually saw because I think the descriptions that circulated later in news feeds and political analyses and the compact's own incident reports missed something fundamental about what happened. They described it in terms of ship counts and weapons exchanges and tactical outcomes. Those things are all accurate. They are also somehow not the point. The compact blockade fleet had 30 vessels. They were drawn from 3 different member species, each with its own command structure, its own communication protocols, and its own chain of authorization for engagement decisions. They were a coalition, which is a word that means, among other things, that before anyone fires, someone has to ask someone else for permission, and that someone has to ask someone above them, and the chain runs up and up until it reaches a body that can authorize the use of force, and that body is committees. The human fleet did not have that problem, not because they had a perfect command structure, though Admiral Vale's control of the situation was precise, but because every captain in that system already knew what they were doing and why. They did not need permission for the obvious. They needed coordination for the complex, and Claire Hobbs's small team provided that coordination with a quietness that was, in its own way, the most unsettling thing I witnessed that day. The compact fleet attempted to hold the perimeter. They were positioned in a standard containment formation, which is an extremely effective configuration if the force you are containing is moving toward you in a predictable pattern. Human vessels did not do that. They moved in overlapping diagonal approaches that forced the compact ships to make rapid formation adjustments. Those adjustments created gaps. The gaps were not random. They appeared in precisely the places where human vessels were already repositioning to exploit them. I asked Claire Hobbs, in the second hour, how long they had been planning the approach vectors. She said, since we arrived in system. I said, that was 4 days ago. She said, yes. The compact fleet held for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Their commanders made good decisions, by any standard measure. They were skilled officers from experienced species. They adapted their formation 3 times in response to the human fleet's movement patterns. They held their cohesion longer than most analysts later said was possible. What they could not adapt to was the fact that, by the time they made each adjustment, the human fleet had already accounted for it. In the 3rd hour, a compact cruiser from the Silhari contingent found itself in an approach corridor that it had identified as an exit route 11 minutes earlier. The corridor had been open when the Silhari commander marked it. By the time the vessel moved toward it, 4 human ships had taken up positions covering every angle of approach to that corridor, not because anyone had seen the Silhari commander make the decision, but because the human positioning predicted what a rational commander in that situation would do. The Silhari commander later told the Compact Inquiry Board, "They were not responding to our decisions. They had already planned for them." In the 4th hour, the compact blockade fleet began a coordinated withdrawal. It was not a rout. It was an organized disengagement executed with discipline. 11 compact vessels sustained significant damage. 6 were disabled and required recovery operations by their allied ships. None were destroyed. This was not an accident. It was the result of specific orders from Admiral Vale, transmitted to the fleet at the start of the engagement. We are here for the people on the planet. We are not here for this fleet. The withdrawal was completed at 1:17 past the 4-hour mark. The last compact ship cleared the inner system at 4:17. The human fleet did not pursue. The moment the withdrawal was confirmed, something remarkable happened. From my position on the observation deck, I watched the shape of the fleet change. Vessels that had been in combat formation began moving toward the planet. Not some of them, all of them, in a smooth redistribution that had the quality of water finding a new level. The combat was over, the rescue was beginning, and the transition between them took 40 minutes. I was on the second shuttle down to the surface. The first shuttle carried medical personnel and equipment from the colony ship Morgan's Light, which had been carrying a full hospital module for a resettlement operation it had been diverted from. The module was deployed in the colony's central square within 2 hours of the shuttle landing. By the time I reached the surface, the colony streets smelled of the field antiseptics that doctors use when they are setting up fast. The colony of Vethara's Deep was, in some ways, not what I had imagined from the signal. The structures were intact. The people had maintained their homes, their gardens, their community spaces, with the stubborn, ordinary dignity of people who intend to keep living and behave accordingly. What was wrong was quieter than ruin. It was in the pallor of the adults I passed, the way they moved slowly, the way they stopped and held onto walls in moments of dizziness. The toxin in the water worked gradually. Over 6 months it had weakened them without yet taking them. It had been, the Velhari Syndicate's internal study noted, designed to look like natural illness. I found the communications array at the center of the colony, in a low building that had once been the community planning office. It was not sophisticated equipment. It was a standard emergency transmitter, the kind that comes in every colonial resettlement kit, with a hand-printed operating guide taped to the side of the housing. Someone had modified the frequency controls with what appeared to be a piece of wire and a great deal of careful patience. Sitting beside the transmitter, cross-legged on the floor, was a girl of about 9 years old. She had dark hair cut practically short, and the kind of calm face that has run out of tears not because there is nothing left to feel, but because crying takes energy and energy has to be managed. She looked up at me when I came in. I said, "Are you Saya?" She said, "Yes." I said, "My name is Kale. I heard your signal." She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "Did it work?" I could not speak for a few seconds. I looked at this child who had spent 4 months sitting beside a transmitter, reciting coordinates into the void, believing that someone would hear her even when every reasonable calculation said the signal was going nowhere. I said, "Yes, it worked." She nodded as if this confirmed something she had already decided. Then she said, "There are 112 of us in the shelters. The adults are very sick. They need doctors." I said, "The doctors are already here." She stood up then, just stood up, straightened her clothes and said, "I should show them where everyone is." And she walked out of the communications room and began leading me toward the shelters, explaining in a clear, organized voice exactly how many people were in each location, what their conditions were, and what supplies they had used in the last week. She had been keeping records, careful, detailed records, written in a small notebook she pulled from her jacket pocket. I followed her through the colony, watching the doctors and medics fan out to the locations she identified, watching the adults emerge from the shelters with the tentative relief of people who had stopped believing in the possibility of rescue and were now recalibrating. I thought about the Compact Council running their numbers. I thought about the precise political calculation that had concluded 4,000 lives were not worth a diplomatic incident. I thought about 214 ships that came with no orders. Around me, on the plain of Vethara's deep, under a pale orange sky, humanity was doing what it had always done when the calculation said the cost was too high. It was ignoring the calculation entirely and doing what needed to be done. I sat down on a low wall near the medical station and watched, and I thought, the galaxy is watching this too. Every species with an intelligence feed, every compact member with access to the sensor logs of the ships that just withdrew. They are all watching this, right now. Watching humans move from combat to rescue in 40 minutes flat. Watching a child lead doctors through a colony she has been running by herself for 4 months. Watching a fleet of ships that nobody ordered begin packing up their combat frameworks and converting their cargo holds to hospital space. I knew what that silence meant. I had heard it before, in smaller ways, in the 2 years I had spent on the ardent vigil reading alien diplomatic communications. It was the silence of something being recalibrated, of a model being updated, of a galaxy remembering something it had spent 80 years allowing itself to forget. The Compact had called us unpredictable. They had called us the species that does not calculate the cost. Watching Saya, notebook in hand, directing a field doctor toward Shelter 7, I thought, they were wrong about that too. We calculate the cost. We calculate it exactly. We simply value different things than they expect. 3 months after the engagement at Vethara's Deep, I sat before the Galactic Compact's Grand Tribunal on charges of unauthorized transmission on a prohibited frequency band in violation of Compact Treaty Law 17, Section 4, Subsection 9. The maximum sentence was 30 years exile from compact space. The minimum was 10. The tribunal chamber was in the compact's primary administrative station, a structure so large it had its own internal transit system. The chamber itself seated over 400 observers, representatives from member species who had requested access to the proceedings. Every seat was filled. There were also 1,700 registered viewer feeds from species who had not been allocated observer seats but had applied for remote access. The Compact had approved all 1,700 applications, which was unusual. I later learned they had approved them because denying them would have looked worse. Commander Alan Voss sat in the observer gallery. Lieutenant Harry Good sat beside him. Petty Officer Dana Cole was there too, in her dress uniform, her expression carrying the same quality it had in the corridor of the Ardent Vigil when she had told the Compact security officers that I was not going anywhere. I noticed she had brought a notepad and was taking notes. Admiral Soren Vale was not present in the chamber. He was on Vethara's Deep, overseeing the 4th week of the colony's remediation operation. He had sent a written statement to the tribunal. I read it before the proceedings began. It was 4 sentences long. The last sentence said, "The person who made that transmission did what the Compact's own systems failed to do, and if the Compact cannot understand the difference between breaking a law and breaking a promise, then the Compact's legal framework has a problem that is considerably more serious than Cale Mercer." I had not expected help from that quarter. The help I had least expected came from Elder Thesson. Elder Thesson of the Vreth appeared before the tribunal in the 2nd hour of the first session. She had not been called as a witness by either side. She had requested permission to address the tribunal on her own initiative, which was, I was told by my legal representative, an almost unprecedented procedural move. The tribunal had granted it after a brief private session whose duration suggested it had not been an easy decision. Elder Thesson stood before the tribunal and spoke for 40 minutes. She was precise and unhurried and said everything that needed to be said without a single wasted word. She described the Compact's administrative failure at Vethara's Deep. She described the Velhari Syndicate's deliberate suppression of the colony's communications. She named the 3 arbiters who had approved the suppression order, all 3 of whom had by that point resigned their positions pending investigation. She described the role my transmission had played in bringing the colony's situation to light, and in catalyzing the response that saved 4,214 lives. Then she said something that I have thought about many times since. She said, "This tribunal is asked to consider whether Cale Mercer broke compact law. He did. That is not in dispute. But this tribunal should also consider what compact law was broken alongside it. The Omega-7 prohibition exists because the Compact feared what humans might do if given open channels of coordination in a crisis. That fear was, historically, reasonable. What the Compact did not account for was that the same quality that makes humans dangerous in conflict makes them extraordinary in rescue. You cannot have one without the other. The Compact attempted to manage humanity by managing their access to communication. Vethara's Deep is what happens when you manage people instead of listening to them." She paused. Then she said, "I recommend this tribunal discuss proportionality very carefully before rendering a verdict." The tribunal deliberated for 6 days. I spent those 6 days in a compact administrative suite that was comfortable in the way that very expensive waiting rooms are comfortable. I had access to a communication terminal and used it to follow the news from Vethara's Deep. The remediation operation was proceeding on schedule. The Velhari Syndicate's ore extraction licenses across 12 systems had been suspended pending the completion of the criminal accountability inquiry. 7 compact administrative officials had been referred for formal charges. The 3 arbiters who had signed the suppression order were facing proceedings in 3 separate compact legal systems simultaneously. The 14 member species who had opened independent investigations into their compact delegations were, as far as I could tell, finding things that had nothing to do with Vethara's deep and everything to do with having finally decided to look. The disclosure of the Velhari files had produced a kind of institutional audit that the compact had not experienced in several decades. The results were uncomfortable for a great many officials in a great many offices. The compact was not collapsing. I want to be clear about that. It was, in its way, doing what institutions do when confronted with evidence of their own failures. It was generating paperwork at an enormous rate while simultaneously insisting that the paperwork meant everything was being handled. But underneath the paperwork, something was changing. The political architecture built on the assumption that humanity was manageable was quietly being dismantled and rebuilt without anyone formally acknowledging that was what was happening. On the 5th day of deliberation, I received a communication from Saya. She was on a compact medical transport bound for a rehabilitation facility. Her message was written in the direct, undecorated style of someone who has not yet learned to decorate their writing with pleasantries. It said, "Kale, my mother is getting better. The doctors say the treatment is working. She will be completely recovered in 4 months. I told her about you. She wants to know if you like coffee cake because she wants to make you one when this is over. I told her you probably do. I hope that was right, Saya." I read it 4 times. Then I wrote back and told her that yes, I did like coffee cake very much. On the 6th day, the tribunal rendered its verdict. Charges dismissed. The grounds cited were demonstrable necessity under conditions of institutional failure, a legal standard that the tribunal noted had never been applied to an Omega-7 violation before and would, going forward, require formal codification in compact treaty law. The tribunal also issued 3 secondary rulings. The first established that emergency distress signals could be rebroadcast without penalty by any licensed signals operator if the original signal met defined criteria for urgency and humanitarian necessity. The second formally opened a compact-wide review of all colonial resettlement records over the preceding 20 years. The third censured the Compact's Communication Oversight Bureau for the failure of their monitoring systems that had allowed a distress signal to go undetected for 4 months. I walked out of the tribunal chamber into a corridor where Commander Voss, Lieutenant Good, and Petty Officer Dana Cole were waiting. Voss shook my hand. Good clapped me on the shoulder. Dana Cole looked at me with the same expression she had worn in the corridor of the Ardent Vigil and said, "I took notes on the whole thing. I am going to write a paper." I said, "About what?" She said, "About compact legal theory and its failure to account for human response patterns. I figure if they are going to rewrite their treaty law, they might as well have some good data to work from." I said that sounded like a very good idea. I went back to Vethara's Deep, not to the Ardent Vigil, which had been decommissioned after the diplomatic crisis rendered its position politically inconvenient, just to the colony itself, which was, by the time I arrived, 4 months into its rebuilding and beginning to look like the place it had been before the crisis, and also somehow different. Rebuilt things always are. The remediation crews had cleared the soil contamination from all affected areas. The water table tests were clean. The medical teams had reduced their presence from a full field hospital to a standard clinic with 3 rotating staff. The colony's population was, on the surface, going about the ordinary business of a community that intends to remain. I walked through the main street on a morning that was bright and cool, with the particular orange-tinted light that the local star produces in early hours. There were children in the street, not huddled in shelters, just in the street, doing what children do when the adults in their lives have decided that things are going to be all right. I found Saya at the rebuilt communications array. Someone had replaced the emergency transmitter with proper equipment, and a communications instructor named Paul Garner, on loan from the Colonial Fleet, had been teaching the older children how to operate it. Saya was at the primary console. She was not being taught. She was demonstrating something to Paul Garner, who was nodding slowly with the expression of a teacher encountering a student who has surpassed the lesson plan. She saw me. She raised her hand in the brief, economical wave of someone who does not have time for extended greeting ceremonies, but is genuinely glad to see you. I waved back. Paul Garner saw the exchange and said, "She told me about you. She said you were the one who received the signal." I said yes. He said, "She wants to be a communications officer. I have told her she is already better than half the candidates I have trained." I looked at Saya, who was already back at the console, explaining something to Paul Garner with patient precision. I thought about a 9-year-old girl who had figured out how to modify an emergency transmitter's frequency controls with a piece of wire, because the adults were sick and someone had to send the signal, and she was the someone available. I thought about what it means to be a species that produces, from inside a catastrophe, a 9-year-old who does not decide whether to act, who just acts. I walked back through the colony in the early morning light. Around me, people were opening doors, starting their days, carrying things from one place to another in the purposeful way of people who have decided that their lives are worth the trouble of living them fully. I sat on the low wall near the medical clinic, the same kind of wall I had sat on the day of the rescue, and I thought about everything the galaxy had watched over the past 4 months. The 214 ships, the 72-hour deadline, the 40-minute transition from engagement to rescue, the Grand Tribunal and Elder Thesson standing up to say things that 140 years of diplomatic experience had finally taught her to say. I thought about the Compact rewriting its treaty law, about the species who had watched from a distance and were now, quietly, updating their models, about the phrase in the old Compact archives, the species that does not calculate the cost before it acts. They had meant it as a warning. I had always understood it as one, but sitting on that wall in the orange morning light of Vethara's deep, I thought that maybe it was something else too. Maybe it was, in its way, a description of something the galaxy needed, something that does not stop to calculate when the calculation is designed to produce the answer that suits the powerful and buries the rest. The galaxy had spent 80 years forgetting what we are. It had taken one transmission, one child's voice, and 72 hours to remind them. I do not know if that makes me proud or frightened. Most days, when I think about the 214 ships that came with no orders, and the admiral who said 7 words and meant every one of them, and the girl who taught herself to reach through a forbidden frequency and find the one person listening at 3 in the morning, I think it makes me both. Proud of what we are, frightened of what that means we might have to be. But mostly, on the good days, I think about Sayre at that console, explaining things to a trained communications instructor as if the frequency charts are obvious, as if the signal modifications are simple, as if the idea that someone will listen is not a hope but a certainty. And I think we did not forget, not really, we were just waiting for a reason to remember.